If you're wondering what's going on, again, it's time for the politicians to take up and take responsibility for the atrocious nature of the system that they were able to create that empowered a few people to make a ton of money, basically selling the equivalent of the Brooklyn Bridge. That's not capitalism, that's corruption. We need to deal with that. We need to address the reality of the mechanics of this market, which are amplifying volatility at this point. They are not diminishing it, and we need to be honest about the fact that Lehman Brothers bankruptcy destroyed confidence in the investor community by trapping money overseas that no one expected would ever happen, and as a result makes hedge fund investors cautious. Three things: Lehman Brothers, mechanics of the market, and a horribly flawed system of finance empowered by America's political leaders over the past 10 years.
They know something. I can feel it. Let's get in on it.
200, take them. 200. Lewis. Not yet. Almost. 220, take them. 209. Yeah, got him.
Thought what a difference a few short months can make in the presidential perspective. Take a listen and note the dates in the upper right corner.
Ours is a belief that, one, we shouldn't bail out lenders. And so, in other words, we shouldn't be using taxpayers' money to say, okay, you made a lousy loan, therefore we're going to subsidize you. I mean, this economy rests in the hands of the American people, not in the halls of our government. Our financial institutions are strong, and that our capital markets are functioning efficiently and effectively. We can have confidence in the long-term foundation of our economy. Major sectors of America's financial system are at risk of shutting down. The government's top economic experts warn that without immediate action by Congress, America could slip into a financial panic, and a distressing scenario would unfold.
Well, you saw it right there. You saw before and you saw last night. It was a stark warning and the equally stark contrast from the recent past. Spending $700 billion to rescue the financial system would be hard enough if Washington had the money, but it doesn't, not a penny. So what's all the discussion about? CNN's Christine Romans fills in the blanks.
Just where is $700 billion going to come from? Where it always does.
Treasury doesn't have $700 billion in a big old safe. We have to go borrow.
The piggy bank is already empty, and the government is borrowing to the limit. To pay for this bailout, Treasury Secretary Henry Paulson wants Congress to raise the debt ceiling to a staggering $11.3 trillion. Talk about living beyond your means. Filmmaker and author of IOUSA, Addison Wiggin.
That money just gets tacked on to the bill that we're passing on to future generations.
Wiggin calculates the bill for everything the government has promised but hasn't yet paid for, like Social Security and Medicare, nears $53 trillion. And by the year 2010, your share will reach $38,000.
When President Bush took office, he inherited President Clinton's surpluses, 4 years in a row, budget surpluses, on a trajectory of $5.6 trillion in surplus. And with his reckless economic policies, within 2 years, he had turned that around. And now, 8 years later, the foundation of that fiscal irresponsibility, combined with an anything-goes economic policy, has taken us to where we are today. They claim to be free market advocates when it's really an anything-goes mentality.
I'm a free market guy, but I'm not going to let this economy crater in order to preserve the free market system.
And what we are seeing is completely what the president did not want to see today. He said that this bill was essential to keeping the American economy afloat, and instead what we're seeing now is the Dow plummeting, down 476 points right now. We saw it plummet as much as 700 points just a little while ago on the news that the lawmakers in the House of Representatives were stalling on this bill and then refusing to pass it. Right now the vote stands at 207 voting yay, 226 voting nay.
None of us came here to have to vote for this mud sandwich. I could describe it a lot of different ways. You all know how awful it is. I didn't come here to do this. I didn't come here to vote for bills like this. But let me tell you this. I believe Congress has to act.
On the one hand, you have Republicans not voting for it, but look how many Democrats also did not vote for it. 94 Democrats saying no to this $700 billion bailout.
Well, and that's the ironic thing. You have people from opposite ends of the political spectrum here making very similar arguments. Populists and liberals on the left, this is a bailout for Wall Street. They made this bed. They've got a lie in it. People in my district don't understand why it's important. The calls are running, the emails are running 100 to 1. And Republicans are saying virtually the same thing, while adding that they did not come here to abet American socialism, as one Republican leader put it last week.
The president and congressional leaders insisted this bill was essential for rescuing the economy. It didn't pass. Who's to blame?
The American people don't understand this. I have discussed this on my radio show on WVON in Chicago for a week now. I have literally had 5 people total support this. People don't know. And so if you are a member of Congress, you are there also to represent your constituents. If you're getting 30, 40, 50 to 1 against, that says that, one, people don't like it because they probably don't know what's going on. When you have the Treasury Secretary saying, well, it's dire, what does that mean? People were saying, well, wait a minute, the president has no credibility. We heard weapons of mass destruction. Even members of Congress were saying that. If you don't level with the American people and hold hearings, they can't buy into it. That's why they didn't support it.
They're lying, cheating thieves. I mean, the fact is that they were absolutely dishonest about what this legislation, this bailout of Wall Street would accomplish and the constraints that they put on Wall Street as a result.
Yeah, the headlines on what's in the bill and what's actually in it when you read it are just astonishingly different. The Secretary Paulson and his successor can, under some circumstances, bail out foreign banks, bail out foreign central banks, not required to pay the lowest possible prices. The executive compensation measures, well, I'll gladly take a bailout today and defer into the future collecting my executive comp. And perhaps worst of all, the oversight board to oversee this, well, the secretary will sit on it.
Unbelievable. Unbelievable. Charles, what is your reaction? I mean, if this bill had been passed, think about that.
Let's pretend that $1 trillion is due right now. That means every man, woman, and child will pony up about $3,278.
The rest of the world just wants to see the color of your cash, and they want to see it sooner rather than later, greasing the wheels of the international markets.
Well, foreign banks are buying up American assets. The federal government is bailing out foreign banks.
The plan to rescue the American financial sector. Now comes a clarification that the $700 billion lifeline will also go to institutions overseas.
If a financial institution has business operations in the United States, hires people in the United States, if they are clogged with illiquid assets, they have the same impact on the American people as any other institution.
If we really do need this fund, and a lot of taxpayers are pretty skeptical that we do we really need to take taxpayer money and recapitalize foreign banks?
But what's happening is this bailout proposal helps the few at the expense of the many. It drives us deeper into debt. It doesn't solve the problem. And all it does is bail out some investors and help encourage speculation. If the government starts using the taxpayers' money to insure against risk, well, then all you're going to have is speculation.
Many lawmakers, nevertheless, are predicting that some deal will be worked out. But they are clearly worried about the buyer's remorse they will face if they spend $700 billion taxpayer dollars, and the problem is not fixed.
It's very important for members to take this bill very seriously. It's important to get credit flowing again so that small businesses in our communities will be able to finance their operations.
As those negotiations on the Wall Street bailout intensify and continue, lawmakers adding more and more pages to the proposed legislation, more and more interests are being represented in what is supposed to be a legislation dealing with a crisis. There have been so many additions, in fact, that what was once a 3-page proposal has now ballooned into a document of more than 100 pages. We're told that the document could be even longer by the Congress ultimately finishes its work. But as of right now, we have absolutely no idea what is in this legislation, no specifics, no details at all as to how it would, in fact, reverse what has become a crisis in our financial system. Those sweeteners adding at least $150 billion to the price tag.
That ignores the plight of regular Americans, but includes so-called sweeteners. That is not worthy of support. When Republicans force a bill that slips in more earmarking spending, that's not worthy of support.
So that was Congressman Jim McDermott railing against those so-called sweeteners. Other critics call them pure lard, expensive add-ons attached to the bailout plan that was approved today. Here it is, right here, 451 pages apparently. Joe Johns counting up the high price of all the pork that's in those 451 pages. And Joe, they are called tax extenders, but let's be honest about it, it is pork. For instance,
$110 billion in tax breaks, some for renewable energy, wind and solar power, some for research and development for businesses, and including some tax breaks that some people consider pork, Tony.
Are these people out of their cotton-picking minds?
Well, there are a lot of Democrats in the House of Representatives who are as angry about this as you are, and that's why you saw Steny Hoyer, the majority leader, so frustrated.
There have to be some statesmen left in the United States Senate.
Well, what they've done is attach so many popular items to this bill that they feel it'll appeal to enough people to attract them. Whether that is the best and most profound leadership, it's up to everyone out there to decide.
And Jessica, today everybody pretty much trashing this bill, even if they supported it, whether they voted for it or against it. Let's listen to some of what we heard today.
When this bill passes today, remember those words, in God we trust, because we're going to need his help.
Wall Street wants the $700 billion so bad they can taste it. To get it, they need two things. First, you create panic. Then you block alternatives. And then you herd the stampeding cattle toward passing a bad bill.
I've ultimately concluded that this bill is a necessary evil.
There are no easy answers, but the American people deserve to know there were alternatives.
So, Jessica, anybody happy with this bill?
There's always an outlier, but we have yet to find the person who would be happy with this. I think Boehner summed it up when he called it a mud sandwich earlier in the week. No one likes it. They felt they had to act for fear of what could happen if they didn't. Enormous sense of outrage and anger with the Bush administration, especially Secretary Paulson, for putting this before them with such a sense of panic and a sense that there's no time. They have to act immediately without deliberation. All they're saying now, though, is they want to follow this up with hearings and new regulations that will prevent something similar from happening in the future. It's the best they can offer now.
President Bush is calling the $700 billion bailout essential to helping America weather its economic crisis. He signed the measure just a little over an hour or so ago after the House of Representatives approved it by a vote of 263 to 171.
By coming together on this legislation, we have acted boldly to help prevent the crisis on Wall Street from becoming a crisis in communities across our country. We have shown the world that the United States of America will stabilize our financial markets and maintain a leading role in the global economy.
A relieved President Bush thanked his point man on the financial crisis, Treasury Secretary Henry Paulson, minutes before signing the bill.
Mr. Secretary, you and your team have worked incredibly hard.
Putting pen to paper in the Oval Office, the president made the financial bailout law 2 weeks after his administration first unveiled its $700 billion financial rescue plan to Congress. And a remarkable turnaround from Monday's stunning House defeat.
Shame, shame, shame on Congress.
Lawmakers passed a modified version of the original rescue plan.
I don't think any of us can lose sight of the fact of how the markets have really collapsed since Friday when they passed that $700 billion bailout package. It's been almost about 1,000 points. It's gone down since then, yesterday and today. That slide continuing 500 points alone today, and that's certainly going to be hovering over this debate.
What we've seen the last few days is nothing less than the final verdict on an economic philosophy that has completely failed. And I am running for President of the United States because the dream of the American people must not be endangered anymore.
We need to fix the regulatory system and bring it into the 21st century. Of course, we need to have oversight and regulation. And I warned about it. Greed and excess and corruption is beset Wall Street. They've treated it like a casino, and they need to be held accountable and stop walking away with these fat cat packages.
Lawmakers today blasted Treasury Secretary Hank Paulson for his handling of the Wall Street bailout. Members of Congress accusing Paulson of making up strategy and failing to help homeowners. Christine Romans reports.
The architects of the historic bailout of the financial system defended their work to a hearing room thick with skepticism from Democrats.
You seem to be flying a $700 billion plane by the seat of your pants. It seems to be the second largest bait and switch scheme that history has ever seen, second only to the reasons given us to vote for the invasion of Iraq.
Criticism that the initial focus of buying of toxic assets off the bank's books has shifted now to capitalizing the banks.
I spent considerable time selling this program to those who were suspicious and did not want to do it.
She and others said not enough is being done to help homeowners with the bailout money, but the Treasury Secretary said the bailout is working.
The actions of the Treasury, the Fed, and the FDIC have stabilized our financial system.
The Treasury officially abandoned the idea it originally sold Congress, buying up toxic assets. So just how is the government spending your money? Well, half the bailout money, $350 billion, is now available for the next administration to spend.
A state-of-the-art high school like this one being built in Seattle, Washington, can cost $75 million. $10 billion would buy 133 of them.
Treasury just doled out $33 billion to 21 banks. $125 billion has already been pumped into J.P. Morgan Chase, Goldman Sachs, Bank of America, Citigroup, and others. That leaves $91 billion more earmarked specifically for banks. Meanwhile, $40 billion went to AIG, an insurance company. $60 billion is left over. But is it really working? Bernanke and Paulson say so. It has stabilized the financial system, but not the markets, and the economy remains quite weak.
And what's so interesting about what's going on right now is you have people who used to be centrists, like Larry Summers, who's now going to have a lot of power in the Obama White House, who in recent years have been writing pretty radical columns talking about this, and he describes it as, you know, the defining policy of our time, this wealth shift to the wealthy. And now you have a situation where even now, not only are they flying in on corporate jets looking for bailouts, but very few have repudiated the idea of bonuses. What happened to the idea that you only get a bonus when you make money? And we're going to have a lot of people on Wall Street this year who are going to still get bonuses.
Not bonus pool this year. If you read the Forbes story from last week, what they said is, and I'm not in favor of this, by the way, I just pointed out the issue here, that Citigroup is going to pay $25 billion of bonuses. They're going to get $25 billion from the government.
Well,
okay?
I think
that's an issue,
that's
Larry.
That's a different question.
That's the question we're bringing up here. How is the taxpayer bailout money going to the bonus?
It's too easy to go after Wall Street people. Those very bonuses finance, the taxes paid on those bonuses finance the city and state of New York during the good times.
I agree.
You're suggesting or saying that CEOs of some of these banks and mortgage firms, in order to increase their own personal income, deliberately set out to make bad loans?
Yes.
How do they get away with it? I mean, what about their own checks and balances in the company? Or what about their accounting divisions?
All of those checks and balances report to the CEO. So if the CEO goes bad, all of the checks and balances are easily overcome. And the art form is not simply to defeat those internal controls, but to suborn them, to turn them into your greatest allies. And the bonus programs are exactly how you do that.
And that Wall Street has roughly $20 billion in bonus money ready to fly.
We looked at the pay packages that were handed out to the CEOs of the 9 major banks that are getting the equity capital infusion from the Treasury Department. And last year, those 9 CEOs received $289 million combined.
Was the prospect that CEOs and bank executives would take the federal bailout money they were being offered and they would run with it. We'd be suckered into thinking we were saving the whole economy when really we'd just be fattening up those Wall Street fat cats even further. Because they were concerned about this prospect, Congress insisted that any financial firms that accepted any of the $700 billion bailout fund would have to limit executive pay. No more gazillion-dollar salaries, no more bazillion-dollar bonuses or golden parachutes. Not with public money, you don't. That would be an outrage. Congress got it in writing. Yeah.
The human.
Except, according to today's Washington Post, the Bush administration beat them in the fine print. They changed one sentence in the bailout bill so that the executive pay limits only applied to firms that sold their troubled assets to the government in auctions. That, after all, was what the Treasury said they wanted to do with the bailout money. But the Treasury didn't actually do that at all. $355 billion spent, zero of it spent at auction buying troubled assets, which is the only thing the executive pay limit applies to. So even though the limits on executive pay are right there in the law, right in black and white, they're not actually enforceable at all. As my friend Steve Bannon at the Washington Monthly said today, the relationship between Lucy and Charlie Brown keeps coming to mind.
Plenty of folks knee-deep in the mortgage mess are still waiting in money, according to congressional researchers who say Countrywide's boss took $120 million in stock options last year. Citigroup's CEO, almost $40 million when he left the job. Merrill Lynch's former top man, $161 million, leaving after Merrill posted an $8 billion loss in the subprime market.
But even when these guys get kicked out, even when they leave, even when things don't work out, on their worst day, they earn more than most Americans will ever see in their entire lives.
Entangled in the nation's mortgage debacle.
I worry about the whole, this whole culture where the little guy gets squeezed, and the next thing he has nothing but a debt. Not a house, a debt. And then the parachute just drifts on up the golf course.
Golden parachutes to Angelo Mozillo, Countrywide CEO, who made $120 million in stocks and options last year and $400 million in stock sales since 1998. Stan O'Neill, former Merrill Lynch CEO, who got $161 million in stock options and retirement benefits. Charles Prince, former Citigroup CEO, leaving the company last year with a $10 million bonus, $28 million in stocks and options, and $1.5 million in other perks.
You were in the middle of an enormous debacle that ended up costing your companies and shareholders billions of dollars. It cost people their homes, it cost other people their jobs. It seems like everyone is hurting, except for you.
Mozillo says he worked hard for the millions he made at Countrywide, the company he co-founded.
I'm very proud of the homeownership opportunities that Countrywide has provided for over 20 million families.
Many such opportunities on the ropes as credit-challenged homeowners across the nation face the threat of foreclosure. Christine, committee Republicans charged Democratic leaders were in search of villains when in fact there were none. Democrats said, though, there was something wrong with the system that rewarded spectacular financial losses with executive compensation in the millions. Christine?
And sometimes in the tens of millions and even more. Louise Schiavone, thank you so much, Louise.
Hundreds of people today took part in protests across the nation against AIG and Wall Street. Protesters expressing their anger against AIG and other big financial institutions and demanding new action in Congress to stop corporate greed and excess. Organizers saying there were protests at more than 100 locations in over 30 states, including the cities of Washington, New York, Chicago, and Los Angeles. And AIG is not the only taxpayer-funded company that is handing out hefty bonuses. So are mortgage giants Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac. Fannie Mae says it's paying more than $600,000 each to several top executives. Freddie Mac is planning equally large payouts to some of its staff, but is not giving any details. The companies have been given access to as much as $400 billion in government aid.
This should be underlined and highlighted that, in fact, on Capitol Hill, there have been lots of attempts to deal with executive compensation, but both the Bush administration and the Obama administration, we're hearing this more and more from Hill Democrats, they are the ones who were concerned about this, and they were the ones who stopped Congress from putting these caps on the bonuses.
Dana Bash.
In addition to this, half of the money spent so far on these banks will go over the next 3 years to dividends to their shareholders as things stand right now. That is unconscionable, is it not, Professor Morisi?
Absolutely. We haven't seen hubris on the part of aristocrats like those in New York since just before the French Revolution. It's absolutely absurd that Vikram Pandit, who himself was paid $155 million to sell a bogus hedge fund and put the money in his pocket to Citigroup's shareholders, is now prepared to dole out millions and millions more in bonuses to his executives for the privilege of running that bank into the ground and then borrowing tens of millions of dollars from the American taxpayers. And it's not just Pandit, it's Thain over at Merrill Lynch and all the others. This is what destroyed Lehman Brothers. They took half the profits of Lehman Brothers, put it in the pockets of the executives, and essentially declared the place bankrupt. It's obscene. It's beyond reproach.
It is shameful. And part of what we're going to need is for the folks on Wall Street who are asking for help to show some restraint and show some discipline and show some sense of responsibility. You know, the American people understand that we've got a big hole that we've got to dig ourselves out of, but they don't like the idea that people are digging a bigger hole even as they're being asked to fill it up.
But it's not just Republicans assigning blame. More and more congressional Democrats are pointing fingers, too, at the Obama administration. On Wednesday, when CNN's reporting forced Senate Banking Chairman Chris Dodd to reverse himself and admit he was responsible for the loophole allowing AIG employees to keep their bonuses, he said Obama Treasury officials insisted.
The administration had expressed reservations about the amendment. They came to us and asked for modifications.
Now, another Senate Democrat tells CNN the Obama administration blocked his attempt to stop the bonuses.
Treasury Secretary Timothy Geithner today declared he takes full responsibility for that provision in the stimulus bill that allows AIG executives to keep their bonuses. As Dana Bash reported, that provision was inserted into an amendment proposed by Senator Chris Dodd at the request of the Treasury Department. Geithner, who's facing rising questions about his judgment, said he was worried about the possibility of lawsuits.
They left out in this bill, and the Democrats and Republicans are both responsible. No re-regulation of the financial securities industry or regulation of the wild orgy of derivative speculation. No tax on derivatives to make the speculators pay for their old bailout. 1/10 of 1% tax of $500 trillion in transactions this year
but they have
produced $500 billion.
But they have promised that regulation will be coming. It's probably going to come with the next administration. What they wanted to do was get this bailout passed now.
Hey, they gave away the store first, and then they're going to try to bring the sheriff later. It doesn't work that way. Wall Street was over a barrel. Washington had Wall Street over the barrel. They could have had this re-regulation. They could have had shareholder power enhancement to control the bosses. They could have had disclosure. They could have had all kinds of things because Wall Street wanted that bailout. Instead, Wall Street stuffed Washington into the barrel and rolled it.
Main Street went to Wall Street today to protest the bailout plan.
People say, well, why give the banks money? We could give money to homeowners to pay off their mortgage. Is it fair that a company that should be going bankrupt is getting a handout?
If this package goes through, the way I look at it, they've just mortgaged our future.
They live by the free market, let them die by the free market.
There were a lot of people shouting, let them fail. They got themselves into this position, and it's survival of the fittest. And this is what capitalism looks like.
The equivalent of all the income taxes that you pay in January, February, March, April, and a good hunk of May just go to pay interest on the national debt. You know, and that money goes to China, foreign sovereign funds, wealthy individuals, insurance companies. It is a transfer from working people to those who are already wealthy.
Look, we need real investment in people. You know, the problem that we faced in the last couple decades is that, frankly, there has been class warfare against the middle class, against the poor, and on behalf of the 1%. You know, we have essentially been looted as Americans. Money has been taken out of our pockets to give to Wall Street and to give to special interests. Now, I know that in Washington you're not supposed to say stuff like that. That's considered a little out of the mainstream, but in the country that's exactly what people are feeling. And we need to reverse that now, right now. And that's why we need real progressive governance. We need to hold Wall Street accountable. We need to get rid of this idea of corporate personhood. We need corporations to stop running roughshod over people. And we need, in the spirit of big economic fights in the past, like having a weekend, like having a minimum wage, like having Social Security and Medicare, we need to push that forward and make sure that the American dream is alive and well for people. We need to make sure that people are getting paid more. It's absurd that in our country that teachers often are starting off at salaries in the 20% range, low 30% range, when those who provide a lot less service to our society get paid a whole lot more for coming up with things like derivatives, which end up taking our economy.
Wall Street companies like Goldman Sachs were saved by a major financial rescue in 2008 by U.S. taxpayers. AIG was on the verge of going under and on the hook to pay billions to these financial firms for backing risky investments called credit default swaps that were quickly losing their value. The federal government assumed the obligation, shelling out $62 billion to Wall Street companies for these bad investments alone. Representative Darrell Issa, a critic of the Federal Reserve, says it was a sweetheart deal for the banks. Now, according to emails recently obtained by Representative Issa's office, not only did the banks get paid back in full, the Federal Reserve Bank of New York, at the time run by the now Treasury Secretary Timothy Geithner, kept that information from being disclosed to the public. Referring to the debt obligations as synthetics, a lawyer for the insurance giant AIG, which owed the banks billions, responded to a request from a New York Federal Reserve attorney that there be no mention of the synthetics in connection with the transaction. The release of the emails comes at a time when Congress is debating financial regulation, including whether the Federal Reserve is too big, too secretive, and too cozy with members of Wall Street. Last November, the Inspector General criticized the Federal Reserve in New York, saying its strategy effectively transferred tens of billions of dollars of cash from the government to these banks.
Now, what about the cost to the taxpayer here, Doug? There are reports that at the time the Fed stepped in and said you're going to pay 100% on these credit default swap insurance policies that you've handed out here, that AIG was negotiating for, maybe 40 cents on the dollar to entities like Goldman Sachs. And so when the Fed comes in and says, no, pay back 100% with taxpayer money, how much is the American taxpayer out here?
Preferred customers got 100% of the dollar. That's a real problem, and this is big money. I mean, we put $60 billion in quickly. The total got to $180 billion, and if you're paying 40 cents on the dollar, it doesn't look nearly as large.
Right.
Bottom line, taxpayers lose out on every level here, right, Doug?
Absolutely. There's no question about that.
Wow. All right, well, we'll follow and see what happens.
The right hand is out begging for bailout money. The left is hiding it offshore. Keep this in mind the next time you look at your paycheck and you look at all the taxes you're paying. Goldman Sachs pays 1% taxes now, and they're the ones getting bailed out with the money that you pay in taxes.
2008 may be coming to a close, but the financial disaster it brought may be far from over, and we may never know what some of the nation's biggest banks have done with tens of billions of dollars of your money. The bailout money was supposed to be used to jumpstart the economy by re-energizing lending. But some of the banks can't tell you what they did with it. Some of them won't tell you. And some of them even admit they're still working on what to do with it. People on Capitol Hill aren't happy.
When I think about banks and the way that if you bounce a check, they're going to charge you $35 or $50 for a bounced check. And they're going to demand strict accountability. But when they get billions, they don't want to be accountable. There's something wrong with that picture.
21 banks that each got $1 billion or more from the federal government's troubled asset relief programs simply didn't have specifics when the Associated Press asked them, what are you doing with the money? J.P. Morgan Chase, we've lent some of it, we've not lent some of it. We're not giving any accounting of, here's how we're doing it. SunTrust, we're not providing dollar in, dollar out tracking. Bank of New York Mellon, we're choosing not to disclose that.
There is nothing that upsets me more than a bank that comes to the Congress begging for money, and then once they get the money, turn around and say, nah, see you later. I'm not going to tell you anything.
Okay, so why is it that the recipients of billions of federal dollars won't just throw open their books? There's simply no way to tell. But a report earlier this month from the Government Accountability Office says the banks weren't told at the outset that they had a duty to disclose. But the report said without effective oversight, Treasury cannot ensure that those receiving funds are complying with the requirements of the program.
Banks are saying, look, we don't have to tell you taxpayers what we're going to do with this money. Thank you very much. We received part of this $350 billion, these checks. Do you think that they should be required to tell taxpayers that there should be some kind of accounting of what they actually did with the money they received?
Oh, sure, and I think down the road that's going to come out. But you have to keep in mind, when they first passed this bailout idea, they were going to buy troubled mortgages and mortgage-backed securities from these banks and work them out. Remember that? Well, that got thrown out the window because Secretary Paulson felt it wasn't getting money into the financial system fast enough. So we started giving money to banks, and they took preferred stock.
Can we talk about $200 billion in taxpayer money floating into the pockets of shareholders who should be bearing the brunt and the responsibility of the failures of these institutions, and the executives who are taking down billions of dollars when they drove these institutions into the ground?
These executives have quite simply purchased the United States Senator. They've collected enormous campaign contributions from these guys, so now they're willing to turn a blind eye.
You know, I thought the Republicans were supposed to have some compunction about prudence, responsibility, moral hazard. I thought the Democrats were going to actually be serious about constraining excess compensation to CEOs and executives. Both of these parties are frauds, are they not?
Yes, absolutely. What we're doing to the entire financial sector is turning it into Fannie Mae. We're going to have a kind of public-private kind of partnership deal where the risks are all borne by the government and all the profits go to private executives, as was the case with Fannie Mae.
This is a bailout by the federal government of a Wall Street firm, a bailout that's been denied to just about 2 million Americans facing foreclosure or undergoing foreclosure right now. And that is a double standard which we can't afford in this free enterprise democracy of ours.
You save money by losing less if you rewrite a mortgage down a little bit and keep a person in their home than if you have to foreclose on the house. That costs the economy $250,000.
That it looks like huge losses are in the offing under the best of circumstances. Why aren't we taking a controlling interest in mortgage-backed securities and the government directing loan modifications instead of to lower principal, lower interest, instead of leaving it up to people who are still freezing credit here in the States while they're shipping jobs and money overseas? This, to me, is a textbook definition of political insanity. And I would just like, you know, do you ever think about these things? About the inherent contradictions that are in this, about how, you know, Wall Street might have one view of the world, but the rest of America's just beset with all these problems as a result of Wall Street?
They talk about moral hazard on Wall Street and in Washington, D.C. That moral hazard applies just to consumers of fraudulent mortgages in many cases, in hundreds of thousands of cases, but doesn't apply to an institution in which the CEOs made a fortune and a third of the stock owned by the employees and the debt holders being protected by the federal government. That is a double standard of the most sickening kind, and which puts just too little emphasis on the well-being of working men and women and too much emphasis on the elites of Wall Street.
Goldman Sachs off the hook, but now it's the Department of Justice that's getting cooked. Senator Carl Levin, chair of the Senate committee whose investigation spurred the DOJ's probe, totally blasting the decision not to file any criminal charges for the bank's handling of the subprime mortgages. Quote, whether the decision by the Department of Justice is the product of weak laws or weak enforcement, Goldman Sachs' actions were deceptive and immoral. So did the Department of Justice just drop the ball? Well, we're going to ask our panel. Lisa Wheel, Fox News legal analyst, and Doug Burns, former federal prosecutor. Okay, Doug, I'm going to start with you first. As a prosecutor,
yes,
did they drop the ball?
Well, you could certainly argue that they did, because what happened was they brought a civil enforcement action on this, and they got a $550 million settlement. The gravamen, the essence of the allegation, by the way, was that there were touting and pitching a particular commodity,
Right.
which was, mortgage-backed securities.
Right.
While at the same time, this man, John Paulson, was heavily shorting it and betting against it. And the theory was they knew that.
The problem is they only gave it 6 months, though, really, to look at it before they dropped it. I mean, this is a big investigation worth, hundreds of millions, if not billions of dollars. Many people bilked out of their life savings. And so we're gonna drop that after 6 months of an investigation. To me, I'm thinking when I look at that as a prosecutor is, there's got to be more. There's got to be emails. There got to be documents. There got to be people inside the company that you can flip.
Okay,
but it's just
right? If I understand what's going on correctly, they're just walking away and they're not even making them sign tolling agreements.
Right, exactly.
Okay, so
that's
anyway,
surprising.
And why is that?
That's surprising.
Why are they quitting on this? Because really,
doesn't make sense.
To your
Doesn't make
point,
sense.
everyone knew they were on the other side of the trade.
Absolutely. Right.
So what are they doing?
Not much.
Well, the other thing, like I said, we know the label. I'd be curious your view. We're not admitting liability, but by the same token, at least I don't think they'd settle for $550 million.
Settlement. You've done something wrong.
But you know what the problem is? We needed a perp walk for this whole subprime mess, right?
We're not going to have
something.
That's the biggest point of all, is that there's so much cynicism and distrust with the system that sometimes a little symbolic enforcement. By the way, they could have brought a corporate case, right?
Exactly, a corporate case. The other thing is you don't want to just
You two should have tried the case.
No, we would be. We'd be on
6 months and a year is not necessarily a long period of time in investigations. So when they turn around and they put a spin on it, like, we did this assiduously for 6 months. Lisa and I know in the real world that's not a long time.
Do you know what the problem is? Lloyd Blankfein and Goldman Sachs are going to come out again as the untouchables. And again, it just vilifies and demonizes Wall Street.
I agree.
Right? It makes Wall Street look like they got away with it again.
I totally agree with you, Tracy.
They got
Big
away
banks
with
get
it.
away with it, and the little guy gets screwed. Right.
Exactly. We get hurt.
Incredibly, since the start of the financial crisis, Wells Fargo has grown 43% bigger. JP Morgan Chase has grown 51% bigger, and Bank of America is now 138% larger than before the financial crisis began. Can you imagine that? We bailed these guys out because they were too big to fail, and now 3 out of the 4 largest ones are much larger than they were. How did that happen? Well, in 2008, Bank of America, the largest commercial bank in this country, which received a $45 billion taxpayer bailout, purchased Countrywide, the largest mortgage lender in this country, and Merrill Lynch, the largest stock brokerage firm in the country. That's how Bank of America expanded. They were too big to fail. Today, much bigger. In 2008, JP Morgan Chase, which received a $25 billion bailout from the Bush Treasury Department and a $29 billion bridge loan from the Federal Reserve, acquired Bear Stearns and Washington Mutual, the largest savings loan in the country. That's how JP Morgan Chase, a huge bank, became even bigger. In 2008, the Treasury Department provided an $18 billion tax break to Wells Fargo to purchase Wachovia, allowing that bank to control 11% of all bank deposits in this country. Instead of breaking these folks up, these large institutions up, we let them get bigger. In fact, Mr. President, according to Simon Johnson, the former chief economist of the International Monetary Fund, quote, as a result of the crisis and various government rescue efforts, the largest 6 banks in our economy now have total assets in excess, he claims, of 63% of GDP. This is a significant increase from even 2006, when the same bank's assets were around 55% of GDP. You understand what this is about? 4 financial institutions owning over half of the assets of America. You talk about economic power. You talk about political power. That is what we were talking about. Simon Johnson continues, he said, this is a complete transformation compared with the situation in the United States just 15 years ago, when the largest 6 banks had combined assets of only about 17% of GDP. So today, 15 years ago, 17%, 6 banks, today 4 banks, he claims 63% of GDP. In other words, Mr. President, over the last 15 years, the largest banks in this country have more than tripled in size. Now, Mr. President, not only are too big to fail financial institutions bad for taxpayers, the enormous concentration of ownership in the financial sector has led to higher bank fees, usurious interest rates on credit cards, and fewer choices for consumers. What do you think happens when you have a few institutions, a handful of institutions, controlling mortgage lending or the ability of people, where people get their credit cards? Today, Mr. President, these huge financial institutions have become so big that according to the Washington Post, the 4 largest banks in America now issue 1 out of every 2 mortgages, 2 out of 3 credit cards, and hold 4 out of every $10 in bank deposits in the entire country. Mr. President, if any of these financial institutions were to get into major trouble again, taxpayers would be on the hook for another substantial bailout, and we cannot allow that to happen. So the whole reason for the bailout is that if any of these financial institutions collapsed, it would take down a significant part of the economy and millions of jobs. We had to prop them up. We had to bail them out. And it turns out that since we bailed them out, these handful of financial institutions are now even larger than they were before. And we now know they are enjoying very strong profits, and they are paying their CEOs even more in compensation than they did before the breakdown.